My alarm didn't go off this morning. Not the most auspicious start to a Tuesday, but hardly the end of the world. I rushed through my shower, cursing under my breath as I realized the hot water was barely lukewarm. The building manager had promised to look at the water heater last week. One more thing to follow up on later today. I made a mental note as I toweled off, teeth chattering slightly. Already 15 minutes behind schedule. The radio clicked on automatically when I started my car. I was halfway to work when the regular morning show cut out mid-sentence. A harsh tone filled the car interior, followed by that familiar automated voice. "This is an emergency alert. This is not a test." I sighed, turning the volume down slightly. Probably another flash flood warning or amber alert. Then I heard the words that made me pause with my fingers still on the volume button. "A nuclear detonation has been detected over central Kansas." Repeat, "A nuclear detonation has been detected over central Kansas. All citizens are advised to remain indoors and await further instructions." I blinked, certain I'd misheard. A nuclear detonation? That couldn't be right. The message repeated once more before the radio returned to the morning show hosts, who sounded equally confused. "We're trying to get confirmation on that alert," one of them said, his usual confident patter noticeably shaken. "Stay tuned as we attempt to contact authorities for more information." I pulled into the office parking lot, checking my phone. No news alerts, nothing on social media about any nuclear event. Surely if something that catastrophic had happened, my phone would be blowing up with notifications. The roads had been slightly emptier than usual during my commute, but nothing dramatic. Just a typical Tuesday. Must have been a technical error, I decided. Someone at the emergency broadcast center had pressed the wrong button. It wouldn't be the first time. I remembered the false missile alert that had panicked Hawaii a few years back. The office was quieter than normal when I walked in. Several desks sat empty, and those who were present seemed distracted, hunched over their phones. "Did you guys hear that emergency alert?" I asked, setting down my bag. Lisa from accounting looked up. "Yeah, bizarre, right?" My husband called from the road. He heard it too. "Must be a mistake," I said, logging into my computer. "If a nuke went off in Kansas, we'd know." "That's what I figure," she agreed, but her expression remained troubled. "But why haven't they issued a correction yet?" "Good question." I opened a news site, surprised to find nothing on the homepage about a nuclear event or a false alarm. Just the usual political squabbles and celebrity gossip. An hour passed. The office remained half empty, and those present accomplished little actual work. Conversations kept circling back to the alert. Phones buzzed constantly with text messages. Our internet connection seemed unusually slow, pages taking forever to load. Around 10 a.m., our manager called an impromptu meeting. "I know everyone's concerned about the emergency broadcast this morning," he began, looking more disheveled than usual. "Corporate has advised us to continue normal operations while they monitor the situation. If anyone needs to contact family in the affected region, you can use the conference room for privacy." "Has there been any official confirmation?" I asked. "What exactly happened?" He hesitated. "Details are still unclear. Initial reports suggest some kind of military exercise or test gone wrong, but nothing's confirmed." "So there wasn't actually a nuclear explosion?" someone else asked. "Apparently not in the traditional sense," he answered carefully. "The alert was triggered by detection systems, but satellite imagery shows no explosion crater or mushroom cloud. That's all I know." The meeting dispersed with more questions than answers. I returned to my desk and tried calling my cousin who lived in Wichita, but the call wouldn't connect. "Network busy." I sent a text instead. "You guys okay? Heard something happened." No response. By lunchtime, news was finally trickling in. Headlines were cautious. Unspecified incident in Kansas airspace. Military confirms missile launch, denies detonation. Kansas emergency services activated as precaution. I scrolled through articles that contained plenty of words, but little substantive information. Official statements confirmed a nuclear-capable missile had been detected over Kansas, but insisted it had failed to detonate conventionally. What the hell did that mean? My cousin finally texted back, "We're fine." Weird day. Military everywhere. Dad says nothing to worry about. That was something, at least. If people in Kansas weren't panicking, maybe this really was just a bizarre technical malfunction blown out of proportion. The afternoon dragged on. Each time I refreshed the news, contradictory information appeared. One source claimed the missile had broken apart midair. Another suggested it had been successfully intercepted, and a third reported it had hit the ground without detonating. By 4 p.m., half the office had left early to be with family. Our manager didn't object. I stayed, partly because I lived alone and partly because the confusion annoyed me. I wanted answers before giving in to what increasingly felt like collective hysteria. The drive home was eerily quiet. Traffic was sparse, and I noticed for the first time that I hadn't seen a single airplane in the sky all day. Usually, our city had regular air traffic from the nearby regional airport. At home, I turned on the TV to find a press conference in progress. A stern-faced military official was speaking. "We can confirm that at 6:17 a.m. Central Time, an anomalous aerial event occurred over central Kansas. Contrary to initial reports, there was no conventional nuclear detonation. The public is in no immediate danger. Precautionary measures are being implemented while the incident is fully assessed." A reporter shouted, "What exactly does anomalous aerial event mean? Was it a missile or not?" The official's expression remained impassive. "We are not at liberty to disclose operational details at this time. Again, there is no immediate danger to the public." Another voice, "Why are cellular networks down across 3 states? Telecommunications companies are implementing precautionary bandwidth restrictions to ensure emergency services maintain priority communications." The non-answers continued until I switched off the TV in frustration. I opened a beer and stepped onto my apartment balcony, watching as the sun began to set. That's when I noticed it. The sunset looked wrong. The colors were too vibrant, the reds too deep, purples where there should have been blues. I'd never seen a sunset quite like it before. Beautiful but unsettling. I took a photo with my phone, then noticed I had no service bars. Odd. The building rarely had reception issues. As darkness fell, an uneasy feeling settled over me. The street below was deserted, the neighboring apartments mostly dark. Tuesday evenings were usually alive with activity. People returning from work, restaurants filling up, the sounds of life. Tonight, silence. I finished my beer and went inside, locking the balcony door behind me. For the first time, I felt a trickle of genuine concern. Not fear, just awareness that something wasn't right. The coffee maker could wait. Tomorrow I'd get answers, and life would return to normal. But as I lay in bed, one thought kept circling. If a nuclear warhead had detonated over Kansas, why was there no explosion? Sleep didn't come easily. 2 days after the initial alert, and things were far from normal. I'd gone through the motions of my routine. Shower, coffee, from a new machine I'd picked up yesterday. Commute, but the world felt subtly off kilter, like a picture hanging just slightly askew. This morning, standing on my balcony with my coffee, I realized what had been nagging at me since yesterday. The sky was empty. No planes. No contrails, nothing but an unsettlingly perfect blue expanse. I lived under a major flight path. The absence of air traffic was impossible to miss once I noticed it. Commercial flights must have been grounded, but no one was talking about it officially. The radio in my car crackled to life during my commute, interrupting a somber news segment with another harsh tone. "This is an emergency alert. This is not a test." The same robotic voice as before. Regarding the previous alert about Kansas, no missile was detected. The previous alert was due to a system error. There is no cause for concern. Resume normal activities. I nearly drove off the road. A system error? After 2 days of vague press conferences and military vehicles rolling through downtown? After cellular networks going spotty across multiple states? Bullshit, I muttered, switching the radio off. At the office, attendance was better than Tuesday but still below normal. My manager stopped by my desk around mid-morning, looking like he hadn't slept. "Conference call with the Kansas City branch in 5 minutes, he said, his voice low. "I want you in on it." In the conference room, the video feed showed our Kansas colleagues sitting tensely around their table. Their office lighting seemed unusual, too yellow, somehow making everyone look jaundiced. "Can you give us a ground report?" my manager asked after pleasantries. "The news isn't telling us much." The Kansas City branch manager glanced off camera before answering. "It's quiet. Military at major intersections. They're saying it was a false alarm, but..." He trailed off. "But what?" I prompted. "My brother-in-law works for the State Emergency Management Agency," he continued hesitantly. "He says their radiation detection equipment has been confiscated. Says the feds brought in their own equipment, won't share readings." A woman beside him jumped in. "My kid's school is closed for the week. They're calling it a precautionary measure, but won't say what they're being precautious about." The call continued for 20 minutes, each report more unsettling than the last. Roads closed without explanation. Cell service functioning in some neighborhoods, but completely dead in others. People who'd gone camping in the western part of the state unreachable. After the call, I tried reaching my cousin again. This time the call connected. "Hey," her voice sounded distant, despite the clear connection. "Sorry I didn't call back yesterday. Things are weird here." "Weird how?" I asked, closing my office door for privacy. "Mom went to the grocery store and said there were soldiers checking receipts at the exit. Dad's colleague went to Selena yesterday and said the highway was blocked. They turned everyone around. The official explanation changes hourly." She paused. "And there's something else." "What?" "People are acting strange. Like, Mrs. Hernandez next door? Found her in our backyard at 7 a.m., just staring at the sky. When I asked if she was okay, she said, 'It's coming through nicely,' and walked away." A chill ran down my spine. "Coming through?" "Yeah. Creepy, right? And she's not the only one. Dad says one of his students, he's been teaching remotely since yesterday, just stared at the camera for the entire class without blinking." After we hung up, I spent my lunch break scouring the internet for information. Official news sites remained frustratingly vague, but online forums were buzzing with theories and alleged first-hand accounts from Kansas. One thread caught my attention. "Kansas situation, what they're not telling us." A user claiming to be a meteorologist posted atmospheric readings showing unusual particles detected shortly after the alleged non-detonation. Another user, supposedly a truck driver, described being turned away at the Kansas border by personnel in hazmat suits, not standard military gear. Most disturbing was a post from someone claiming their physicist friend had detected unusual radiation spikes. Not gamma radiation typical of nuclear explosions, but something their equipment couldn't properly classify. I was still scrolling when my phone buzzed with a news alert. Government confirms missile detection was system error. Apologizes for unnecessary concern. The timing felt too convenient, too coordinated with the morning's emergency broadcast. If it was truly a system error, why wait 2 days to clarify? Why the military presence? Why ground flights? That evening, I called my parents in Colorado. "The news here is talking about some kind of technical glitch," my father said. "Your mother's been worried sick about you, being so much closer to Kansas. Have you noticed anything unusual there?" I asked. "Well, now that you mention it, internet's been spotty. And Bill next door, you remember Bill, said his son's National Guard unit was activated Tuesday morning. No explanation given." After we hung up, I turned on the TV. A panel of experts was discussing the unfortunate system error with the emergency alert system. Their expressions were too composed, their talking points too aligned. Not one asked the obvious questions. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Look outside. 8 p.m. Probably a wrong number, but at 8 o'clock, I found myself peering out my window anyway. 3 houses down, my neighbor, Rob or Ron, I could never remember, was loading suitcases into his car. At 8 p.m. on a Thursday. His movements were hurried, furtive. Acting on impulse, I threw on a jacket and walked down the street, trying to appear casual. "Hey," I called out. "Everything okay?" He startled, nearly dropping the duffel bag in his hands. His face relaxed slightly when he recognized me. "Oh, yeah, fine. Going somewhere nice?" I nodded toward the packed car. He glanced around before answering, his voice lowered. "My sister's place in Oregon. Taking the family for an extended visit. Because of what happened Tuesday." His eyes narrowed. "You seem like a sensible person. I'll just say this, they're lying about what's in the air." He slammed the trunk shut. "I've got a buddy at the Air Force Base. Whatever happened, it wasn't nothing, and it wasn't a conventional threat." "What was it then?" He shook his head. "Don't know. But when my friend called to tell us to get out of the region, his voice sounded different. Like he was reading from a script. Then he hung up and hasn't answered since." A car door opened, and a woman, presumably his wife, leaned out. "We need to go, Mark." He nodded to her, then looked back at me. "Good luck," he said, climbing into the driver's seat. I watched their taillights disappear down the street, an uneasy feeling settling in my stomach. First the unsettling sunset, now this. Perhaps I was overreacting, allowing conspiracy theories and neighborhood paranoia to get to me. But what if I wasn't? Back in my apartment, I packed a small emergency bag just in case. Water, non-perishable food, first aid supplies, battery pack for my phone. Better to be prepared and feel foolish than the alternative. As I zipped the bag closed, my eyes drifted to the window. The night sky looked different somehow. The stars seemed brighter, yet fewer in number, as though some had simply winked out of existence. And something else, something I couldn't quite place. A faint shimmer in the air, visible only from certain angles, like heat distortion on a summer day. But it was nowhere near warm enough for that. I closed the blinds, suddenly not wanting to look anymore. The rational part of my brain insisted there were reasonable explanations for everything. Atmospheric conditions from weather patterns, increased military presence due to international tensions, communications disruptions from satellite issues. But a growing part of me suspected we weren't being told the truth. A nuclear warhead had allegedly detonated over Kansas, yet produced no explosion. Now people were acting strange, the government was contradicting itself, and my neighbor was fleeing in the night. I lay awake in bed, wondering what daylight would reveal tomorrow, and whether I should consider leaving town myself. The red digits of my alarm clock read 2:17 a.m. when I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of empty skies and voices that weren't quite human. Friday morning arrived with an official announcement that radiation monitoring stations were being established nationwide. A purely precautionary measure, according to the stern-faced government spokesperson on my TV. There is no cause for public concern. No cause for concern. The phrase had been repeated so many times over the past 3 days that it had lost all meaning. If there was truly nothing to worry about, why the radiation monitors? Why the continued military presence? Why the inconsistent stories? I called in sick to work. Not entirely a lie. My sleep had been fitful, plagued by strange dreams of shadowy figures standing motionless under streetlights. I woke feeling unrest, with a dull headache pulsing behind my eyes. After 2 cups of coffee, I decided to drive to the grocery store. If nothing else, I could stock up on supplies in case things deteriorated further. The rational part of my brain insisted I was overreacting, but Mark's hasty departure last night had left me unsettled. The drive revealed how much had changed in just 3 days. A military checkpoint had been established on the main road into town. Armed soldiers waved most cars through after a cursory glance, but occasionally pulled vehicles aside for inspection. I was allowed to pass without stopping. The grocery store parking lot was fuller than I'd expected. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Shoppers moved quickly, avoiding eye contact, carts piled with bottled water and non-perishables. Several shelves already stood empty. I grabbed what I could, including batteries, candles, and a hand-crank radio I found on clearance. As I waited in the checkout line, the store's television flickered to an emergency broadcast. "This is an emergency alert. This is not a test." That same mechanical voice. "Remain indoors. Air quality monitoring in progress. This is a temporary precautionary measure. Updates will follow." The cashier continued scanning items as if nothing had happened. Around me, shoppers exchanged glances but kept their places in line. 3 days ago, such an announcement would have caused panic. Now it barely registered as unusual. "They've been playing that message every hour," the cashier said flatly when she caught me staring at the screen. Different wording each time. First it was "stay tuned to official channels," then "avoid unnecessary travel." Now it's "stay indoors." Tomorrow they'll probably tell us to hop on one foot and sing the national anthem. Her attempt at humor fell flat in the heavy atmosphere. On the drive home, I had to deter twice around newly established roadblocks. Neither was manned by regular police, but by military personnel who offered no explanation for the closures. Back in my apartment, I turned on the news. Reports were coming in from Kansas about people experiencing unusual symptoms, headaches, nosebleeds, disorientation. Officials dismissed these as mass hysteria, a psychological response to the false alarm. "There is no radiation present," a health official insisted on screen. "The symptoms being reported are consistent with anxiety and stress reactions." My phone rang, Lisa from work. "Are you really sick, or are you just freaked out like everyone else?" she asked without preamble. "Bit of both," I admitted. "Have you seen the new roadblocks?" "Yeah. My husband tried to drive to his mother's house in Springfield this morning. They turned him back at the highway, said it was closed for maintenance, but he could see cars being let through with special passes. We talked for a few minutes about the situation, sharing what little concrete information we had, which wasn't much. "Oh," she added before hanging up, "check your email. Work sent something weird." I opened my laptop to find a company-wide email instructing all employees to report to the office Monday with government-issued ID for security credentialing procedures. No explanation was provided. As I closed my email, I noticed my laptop was behaving strangely. The cursor jumped erratically across the screen, and programs opened and closed without input. Initially, I suspected a virus, but then my phone began exhibiting the same behavior. Apps launching themselves, the screen brightening and dimming in an odd, almost rhythmic pattern. Even more disturbing, when I unplugged both devices, they continued to malfunction in exactly the same way. It wasn't random. There was a pattern to it, almost like Morse code, but nothing I could decipher. Remembering something I'd read in the online forums, I dug out an old Geiger counter from my emergency kit. I'd purchased it years ago during a phase of disaster preparedness enthusiasm, never expecting to actually use it. The device showed normal background radiation levels. According to this, at least, there was no danger. But something about the government's insistence on the absence of radiation, coupled with their deployment of monitoring stations, nagged at me. On a hunch, I disassembled the Geiger counter and examined its components. Everything seemed in order. Then I remembered a project from my college physics days, building a simple radiation detector using household materials. It wouldn't be as accurate as a commercial device, but it might register something the government-approved counters were calibrated to ignore. An hour later, I had a crude but functional detector assembled from parts in my junk drawer and a smoke alarm. I powered it up, not expecting much. The device immediately emitted a series of rapid clicks. I tested it in different areas of my apartment. The clicking intensified near windows and exterior walls. Whatever it was detecting, it was coming from outside. But if it wasn't conventional radiation, what was it? I spent the afternoon researching alternative radiation forms. Most results were scientific papers beyond my comprehension or conspiracy theories too wild to credit. One forum post, however, caught my attention, a discussion about non-ionizing radiation that might affect electronic equipment without registering on standard detectors. The more I read, the more plausible it seemed that something was in the air, just not what we typically associate with nuclear events. Around dusk, I stepped onto my balcony with both the commercial Geiger counter and my homemade detector. The contrast was stark, one silent, the other clicking frantically. The sky had taken on that strange quality again, colors too vivid, shadows too deep. Something dark fluttered in my peripheral vision. On the railing of my balcony lay a small bird, motionless. I approached cautiously. It was dead, no visible injuries, but when I gently turned it over with a stick, I gasped. The underside of its feathers displayed an iridescent pattern I'd never seen before, geometric shapes that seemed to shift and change as the light hit them from different angles. They almost resembled circuit patterns, etched in a rainbow of metallic hues that shouldn't exist in nature. I backed away, suddenly reluctant to touch anything outside. Whatever had killed this bird, whatever had created those impossible patterns, was not something I wanted to expose myself to. Back inside, I sealed the balcony door with duct tape around the edges. Probably useless, but it made me feel better. My electronic devices continued their strange behavior, and now I couldn't help but see a correlation. The same patterns of light and movement mimicked the iridescent geometries on the bird's feathers. The television suddenly turned itself on, tuned to an emergency broadcast channel. But instead of the usual alert, the screen showed only static, punctuated by brief flashes of what looked like text, too quick to read. I recorded it with my phone and played it back frame by frame. Most of it remained indecipherable, but one phrase appeared clearly for a single frame. Containment breach level 4. Below it, barely legible. Non-standard physics event. Then the power went out, plunging my apartment into darkness. In the sudden silence, without the background hum of electronics, I could hear something else, a faint, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It matched perfectly the pattern my devices had been displaying. Standing there in the dark, listening to that impossible sound, I finally accepted what part of me had suspected since Tuesday. Whatever had happened over Kansas wasn't a failed detonation, a technical error, or anything within our normal understanding of reality. Something had changed in the world, and despite the government's insistence that there was no cause for concern, I knew with growing certainty that we were only seeing the beginning of it. Saturday morning arrived with power restored, but no explanation for the outage. The news reported it as a grid stability issue, affecting several neighborhoods in my area. The same neighborhoods, I noticed, that surrounded the main roads leading out of town. I spent the early hours checking my phone for updates. Social media was a chaotic mix of official reassurances, conspiracy theories, and increasingly disturbing first-hand accounts from around the region. One post caught my attention. A woman from a small town just outside the Kansas border reported that her elderly neighbor had disappeared overnight, leaving behind a half-eaten meal and the TV still running. It could have been anything, a medical emergency, a planned trip the woman didn't know about. But similar reports were appearing with alarming frequency. People vanishing without warning, sometimes mid-conversation. My cousin in Kansas wasn't answering texts. When I tried calling, an automated message informed me that the number was temporarily out of service. Her social media accounts showed no activity since Thursday afternoon. Around noon, my phone buzzed with another emergency alert. This is an emergency alert. This is not a test. Containment protocols established. Kansas quarantine successful. Remain in your homes. Normal services will resume shortly. Quarantine? This was the first official acknowledgement that anything was being contained at all. And yet, still no explanation of what needed containment. I tried calling Lisa but couldn't connect. Same with my manager and other colleagues. It was as though everyone associated with my workplace had suddenly gone offline simultaneously. My doorbell rang, startling me. Through the peephole, I saw my neighbor from across the hall, Diane, a nurse at the local hospital. Her normally neat appearance was disheveled, her eyes rimmed with red. I opened the door cautiously. "Diane, everything okay?" She glanced nervously down the hallway before answering. "Can I come in? Please." I stepped aside, letting her enter. She paced my living room, checking windows before speaking. "The hospital is being evacuated," she said finally. "Military showed up this morning. They're transferring patients to facilities outside the city. No explanation, just orders. All patients? No, that's the thing. Only certain ones, those with respiratory issues, pregnant women, anyone immunocompromised." She lowered her voice. "And anyone who's been exhibiting unusual symptoms since Tuesday." A chill ran down my spine. What kind of symptoms? Neurological mostly. Patients reporting lost time, visual anomalies. 3 staff members collapsed yesterday during shift change. All complained of hearing a high-pitched sound no one else could detect. She pulled out her phone, showing me a photo she'd taken surreptitiously, a military officer consulting with hospital administrators. On a whiteboard behind them, partially visible, was a list with the heading, Stage 1 Indicators. "They confiscated our phones when they saw us taking pictures, but I'd already sent this to my personal email," she explained. "They're tracking symptoms, categorizing them by stages. Whatever happened in Kansas, they know exactly what it does to people." The implications were staggering. Not just a containment operation, but a classification system for effects they clearly anticipated. "There's something else," Diane continued. "My colleague Thomas disappeared during his shift last night. Security footage shows him walking into a supply closet, but he never came out. When they checked the closet, it was empty. Could he have slipped out another way?" She shook her head. "It's a windowless room with one door. We use it for storing narcotics. It's monitored 24/7. The footage shows nothing unusual except..." She hesitated. "Except what?" "For about 30 seconds, the image distorts. When it clears, Thomas is gone." Before I could respond, my phone rang, an unknown number. I answered hesitantly. "Hello? Is this line secure?" The voice was familiar. My manager. "What?" "It's just my cell phone. Listen carefully. I don't have much time. Don't come to work Monday. The credentialing procedure is not what they're claiming." "What is it then?" A pause. "They're screening for exposure levels. Anyone above threshold is being taken to quarantine facilities. No one from the first group has returned." "First group? What are you talking about?" "Yesterday. Emergency personnel, key infrastructure workers. They told us it was priority vaccination, but..." His voice cut out momentarily. "Not injecting anything. They're extracting blood, tissue samples. Looking for something." "Where are you calling from?" "Secured my phone before they took it. Using a burner now." "There." The line went dead. I tried calling back. Nothing. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down. Diane was watching me, her expression grim. "It's happening, isn't it? Whatever they're containing in Kansas is already here." Before I could answer, a deep, resonant boom shook the building, rattling windows. We rushed to the balcony. In the distance, dark smoke rose from downtown, near my office building. "Jesus," Diane whispered. My phone lit up with another emergency alert. "This is an emergency alert. This is not a test. Mandatory curfew in effect immediately. Remain indoors." Compliance is mandatory. We spent the next hour scanning for news about the explosion. Official channels called it a gas main rupture, but eyewitness accounts on local community forums described military vehicles surrounding the area before the blast. Around 4 p.m., the internet went down. Then cell service. The silence was absolute and unnerving. "I should get home," Diane said finally. "My husband will be worried." I walked her to the door. "Be careful." She paused. "Whatever's happening, I don't think it's radiation or a virus or anything we'd recognize. It's something else entirely." After she left, I sat in the growing darkness, trying to process everything. My manager's warning. Thomas vanishing from a secured room. My cousin's silence. The government's thinly veiled lies. Then a thought struck me. I hurried to the kitchen drawer where I'd tossed the dead bird yesterday. It was still there, wrapped in a plastic bag. The iridescent patterns on its feathers seemed even more pronounced now, glowing faintly in the dim light. On impulse, I checked the time, 5:37 p.m. I placed the bird on the counter and grabbed my phone to take a photo for documentation. The timestamp read 6:07 p.m. I stared in disbelief. 30 minutes had passed in what felt like seconds. I couldn't recall anything between deciding to photograph the bird and actually doing it. A half hour of my life simply gone. Panic rising, I checked my watch against the microwave clock, the oven display, my phone. They all showed the same time, but none of them had been synchronized. Each device had independently jumped forward 30 minutes. Or I had lost 30 minutes. A movement outside my window caught my attention. Across the street, a figure stood perfectly still beneath a street lamp. From this distance, I couldn't make out details, but something about their posture seemed wrong. Too rigid, head tilted at an uncomfortable angle. As I watched, the figure raised an arm, pointing directly at my window. Then impossibly, it was gone. Not walking away, not ducking out of sight. There one moment, vanished the next. Just like Thomas in the supply closet. Just like my cousin who no longer answered calls. Just like all the people reported missing across social media. The vanishing had begun. I stepped back from the window, heart pounding. For the first time, I understood with crystal clarity that what we were experiencing wasn't a nuclear accident, or radiation, or any conventional disaster. The missile that had supposedly detonated over Kansas hadn't released energy or radiation. It had released something else entirely. Something that could manipulate time, that could make people disappear, that could create impossible patterns on birds' feathers and cause electronics to behave as if possessed. Standing there in my darkening apartment, I realized I was experiencing the first fractures in what I had always assumed was a solid, immutable reality. The world wasn't just changing, it was coming apart at the seams. And judging by the government's response, they had known it would happen all along. I first noticed it 3 nights after the clocks changed, a faint shimmer in the darkness outside my bedroom window. Not the familiar orange glow of streetlights or the blue flicker of televisions from neighboring apartments, but something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. A luminescence that seemed to exist between things rather than emanating from them. I tried to photograph it, but my phone camera captured nothing but normal darkness. Yet when I looked with my naked eyes, I could see it, a subtle distortion like heat waves rising from summer pavement, but with an iridescent quality that reminded me of gasoline on water. That same night, every phone in the city chimed simultaneously. Emergency alert. Do not look directly at the moon. Close all blinds after sunset. This is not a drill. I immediately went to my window, an act of defiance I can't explain. The moon hung bloated and wrongly yellow in the sky. As I watched, something seemed to ripple across its surface, a phenomenon that couldn't possibly be visible from Earth with the naked eye. I closed my blinds. Sleep came eventually, but brought dreams of vast geometries expanding and contracting with mathematical precision, structures that seemed to breathe with a terrible intelligence. I woke with a migraine that medication couldn't touch. At work the next day, or what remained of work with half the staff missing, conversations revolved around the alert. Most assumed it was related to some kind of radiation after all, despite official denials. They're lying about the fallout, said Davis from accounting. My cousin's in FEMA. Says they've got radiation readings that don't make any sense, not gamma or anything they recognize. Then why are the Geiger counters showing normal? I asked. Because they're calibrated for what we know, he replied. Not for what came out of that non-explosion. I thought about telling him what I'd seen in the night sky, but decided against it. I was still clinging to rationality, still believing there must be a logical explanation. solar flares, mass hysteria, something in the water, anything but what my instincts were screaming at me. After work, I stopped by Ellen's desk. She hadn't shown up for 3 days, hadn't called in sick. Her computer was still on, browser open to a scientific journal article about quantum superposition and observer effect. I shouldn't have looked, but with no one around, I scrolled through her browser history. In the days before she disappeared, Ellen had been researching theoretical physics, dimensional boundaries, and something called consciousness as a fundamental property of reality. The last entry was a forum for amateur astronomers, a thread titled, "Kansas Sky Anomaly, What We're Not Being Told." I copied the URL and left quickly, uncomfortable with the intrusion, but more uncomfortable with her absence. At home, I found Ellen's notebook in my mailbox. No note, no explanation of how it got there. Just her familiar handwriting, pages and pages of increasingly disturbed observations. Day 1, standard radiation measurements normal, but EM field readings off the charts. Something's there that doesn't register on conventional equipment. Day 3, light behaves differently near affected areas. It bends at impossible angles. I think what we're seeing is only the shadow of what's really happening. Day 6, our eyes are changing to adapt. I can see colors that don't have names. Day 8, it's not radiation. It's information. Rewriting the basic code of reality. Starting with us. The last entry was scrawled wildly across the page. It's not invasion. It's correction. We were never supposed to be this way. I closed the notebook, hands shaking. Ellen was brilliant, methodical, skeptical, annoyingly rational. Not prone to conspiracy theories or metaphysical speculation. If she'd lost her grip on reality, what chance did the rest of us have? That night, I tried calling my sister in Ohio. The call connected but cut through with bursts of static and voices that weren't hers. Fragments of other conversations, news reports, what sounded like air traffic control communications. Not contained. Spreading at approximately 43 miles per. Cognitive restructuring in 68% of exposed. When my sister finally came through clearly, her voice sounded wrong, pitched slightly too high. "Everything's fine here," she said before I could even ask. "The air is beautiful. You should see how the light moves now." I hung up. Sleep was impossible. I sat in my dark living room, blinds drawn tight, listening to the unfamiliar silence of a city whose normal rhythms had been utterly disrupted. No distant traffic, no voices, no music from the college students next door, who usually played bass-heavy tracks until 2 a.m. Just silence, and occasionally, a sound like many footsteps moving in perfect synchronization. At 3:17 a.m., my television turned itself on. Not to static, but to perfect blackness, from which emerged a voice reciting numbers in a monotone. 1.6180339887, 2.7182818284, 3.14159265535. I recognized them, the golden ratio, Euler's number, pi. Mathematical constants. When I unplugged the TV, my phone began displaying the same numbers scrolling across its screen despite being powered off. By morning, I felt different. The migraine was gone, replaced by a strange clarity of perception. Colors seemed more vibrant. I could hear my neighbors breathing through the walls. When I looked in the mirror, my pupils had changed, not dilated, but somehow altered in structure, with faint lines radiating outward like a starburst. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching everything I could find about Kansas, about nuclear tests that failed, about perception-altering phenomena. Most websites were down. Those that worked contained corrupted information, paragraphs that changed when I refreshed the page. By sunset, I knew I needed to see for myself. Despite the alerts, despite Ellen's warnings, I went to my window and opened the blinds. The moon was gone, not obscured by clouds or in another part of the sky, simply absent, as though it had never existed. In its place was a perfect circular distortion, a lens through which the stars behind it were magnified and shifted into unfamiliar constellations. As I watched, transfixed, light began to pour from this lens, not the reflected light of the sun, but something else. Something that moved with purpose. It flowed down like liquid, branching into thousands of luminous tendrils that reached toward the earth. Where they touched buildings and trees, they didn't illuminate them so much as transform them, rendering them in colors I'd never seen before, colors that shouldn't exist. One tendril moved toward my window. I should have run, should have hidden. Instead, I pressed my palm against the glass, a gesture of either surrender or welcome. I'm not sure which. The light touched the window. The glass became something else, still transparent but humming with information I could somehow read with my skin. Equations, geometries, the fundamental language of a universe adjacent to our own. And I understood what Ellen meant in her final entry. This wasn't destruction, it was correction. We had been living in a flawed approximation of reality, a shadow reality, and now something was rewriting the errors in our code. The nuclear warhead had never been a weapon. It had been a key, unlocking a door that was never meant to be closed. As the light spread across my ceiling, I felt my perception expanding beyond the limitations of human senses. I could see radio waves, could taste the difference between isotopes in the air, could feel the thoughts of others like background radiation. My phone chimed one final alert of the night. Emergency alert. Do not resist the change. It cannot be stopped. For the first time since this began, I felt no fear, only a terrible wonder at what we were becoming. And underneath that wonder, a question I couldn't suppress. Was this transformation happening to all of us, or was I simply going insane? The answer, I suspected, no longer mattered. The military arrived before dawn, their vehicles moving in perfect formation down empty streets. I watched from my window as they established a perimeter, efficient and mechanical in their movements. Hazmat suits, weapons drawn. Not the National Guard, but something else. Units with insignias I didn't recognize, patches that seemed to shift color when viewed too long. No one questioned their authority. Not anymore. By 6 a.m., they had divided the city into sectors. Loudspeakers mounted on Humvees broadcast instructions. This is a mandatory evacuation. Bring only essential items. You will be processed at designated checkpoints. Compliance is non-negotiable. My phone vibrated with what would be the 6th emergency alert since this began. Emergency alert. Remain in designated safe zones. Compliance is mandatory. This message will repeat every 30 minutes. There was something wrong with the message. The syntax too rigid, the cadence inhuman. An automated system, perhaps, or something impersonating one. I packed the bag as instructed, clothes, medication, water, Ellen's notebook. Looking at my apartment, I realized I would never see it again. The certainty of this knowledge didn't come from logical deduction, but from somewhere deeper, a new instinct forming in my altered mind. Outside, families filed toward collection points. Children clutched stuffed animals. Parents carried duffel bags and photo albums. Everyone moved with the dull compliance of trauma victims, eyes downcast, avoiding the increasingly strange patterns forming in the morning sky. At my designated checkpoint, a soldier scanned each resident with a device that looked like a modified Geiger counter, but emitted a soft blue pulse. When my turn came, the device made a sound I felt rather than heard, a vibration that rattled my molars and made my vision blur momentarily. The soldier's eyes widened behind his mask. He glanced at his colleague, a barely perceptible nod exchanged. "Step to the side, please," he said, his voice tight. I was directed to a different truck than my neighbors, along with 7 others who shared nothing obvious in common. An elderly man, a teenage girl, a middle-aged woman in hospital scrubs, a bearded college professor type. What connected us became clear when I noticed their eyes, all with the same starburst pattern in the pupils that I'd seen in my own mirror. We were changing faster than the others. The truck drove for hours. Through the canvas flap, I glimpsed the countryside in fragmented snapshots. Abandoned vehicles on highways, fields with crops growing in impossible geometric patterns, a herd of deer standing motionless, all facing the same direction. No one in the truck spoke. What was there to say? We understood our status, not evacuees but specimens. We stopped at what had once been a community college, now transformed into a military research facility. As we were led through hallways lined with monitoring equipment, I noticed the soldiers themselves weren't immune to what was happening. Some showed subtle signs, hands trembling, eyes blinking in unusual patterns, movements too precise or too jerky. The command structure was fraying. I overheard fragments of arguments between officers. Containment protocols failing at every. Can't maintain quarantine if it affects our own. Should never have tried to weaponize it. They separated us for processing, which meant blood draws, retinal scans, cognitive tests. The medical staff wore expressions of barely controlled panic beneath their professional demeanor. One doctor kept stopping mid-sentence, staring into space as though listening to something no one else could hear. In the examination room, I found my chance. The doctor stepped out to consult with a colleague, leaving their tablet unlocked on the counter. 3 minutes. That's all I had to access files labeled Kansas Event Classified. What I found confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. The nuclear warhead story was indeed fabrication. But not to cover up a conventional military accident. The truth was simultaneously more mundane and more terrifying. We had done this to ourselves. Project LIGHDBNDR, an attempt to weaponize quantum field manipulation. The objective had been to create localized distortions in space-time, tactical reality manipulation. The document used clinical language to describe what was essentially an attempt to punch a hole in the fabric of existence. They had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations and their worst nightmares. The hole they'd created hadn't closed. It was expanding, and something was coming through. Before I could read more, the tablet screen glitched, text rearranging itself into nonsensical patterns before going completely dark. That night, they housed us in dormitories under guard. Through thin walls, I heard the teenage girl sobbing, the professor muttering equations. Outside, floodlights illuminated a chain-link perimeter topped with razor wire. Keeping us in or something else out, I wasn't sure. Around 2 a.m., something impossible happened. I was staring at the ceiling, mapping the cracks to distract myself from the pressure building behind my eyes, when everything stopped. Not just movement, everything. The analog clock on the wall froze. The dust particles suspended in the beam of light from the hallway hung motionless. The sound of distant generators cut to perfect silence. For 6 minutes and 23 seconds, I counted. I alone existed in a pocket of continuing time within a frozen world. I walked the hallways untouched, past immobile guards, their expressions caught in moments of boredom or concern. In the command center, officers stood like statues around a map showing the spread of the anomaly. Perfectly concentric circles expanding outward from Kansas. On their monitors, satellite imagery showed the affected area glowing with that same impossible luminescence I'd seen through my window. Time resumed with a sound like rushing air filling a vacuum. I barely made it back to my room before the guards resumed their patrols, unaware that anything had happened. By morning, the military's last pretense of control had evaporated. Alarms blared intermittently. Personnel ran through hallways with increasing desperation. Through windows, I watched as helicopters arrived to evacuate high-ranking officers. They were abandoning their posts. Abandoning us. The professor, who'd introduced himself as Dr. Levinson, former physicist at MIT, gathered those of us who remained. "They can't stop it," he said simply. "What's coming through that tear isn't malevolent. It's simply incompatible with our reality. Like introducing a new physical law into a system that can't accommodate it." "What happens to us?" asked the nurse in scrubs. "We adapt," he said, "or we don't. But fighting is pointless. This is a fundamental restructuring of reality itself." As if to punctuate his words, the facility's power failed. Emergency lights cast red shadows, transforming familiar faces into maps of alien topography. Through the windows, we watched the soldiers dropping their weapons, removing their helmets, and simply walking away. Not in panic, but with the deliberate movements of sleepwalkers answering a call. By sunset, they were gone. All of them. We were alone in a government facility filled with secrets about our transformation, surrounded by razor wire meant to contain what we were becoming. But by then, we understood the truth. No barrier could contain what was happening, because it wasn't spreading like a contagion from person to person. It was spreading from reality itself. That night, I dreamed of Kansas, of standing at the center of the event, watching as the fabric of existence parted like curtains, revealing something vast and incomprehensible behind the thin veneer of what we'd always thought was real. I woke knowing what I had to do. It was time to head west, toward Kansas, toward the source, toward the truth that our government had tried and failed to control. Dawn came with silence, so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. No birds, no distant traffic, no hum of electricity. The world held its breath. Our small group gathered in what had been the facility's cafeteria, the 8 of us who'd been separated from the regular evacuees. We'd spent the night alone in an abandoned military research station, each processing the implications of being left behind. "They knew we were too far gone," said Dr. Levinson, stirring powdered creamer into cold coffee. "Too contaminated by whatever's coming through." The nurse, Sandra, checked the teenager's vitals. The girl, Zoe, hadn't spoken since the soldiers left. Her eyes had changed the most, the starburst pattern now dominating her irises completely, pupils reduced to pinpoints. We need to try the communications equipment, I suggested, needing to do something, anything that felt like progress. Someone must still be monitoring emergency channels. We found the command center empty but operational, backup generators providing minimal power. When Sandra tried the radio, we heard only strange tonal sequences, rhythmic patterns that seemed almost like language, but nothing human ears should recognize. Yet I understood fragments of it. So did Levinson, judging by his expression. It's mathematical, he whispered. Prime number sequences, but with variations I've never encountered. I turned to the banks of monitors showing static-filled feeds from security cameras. One by one, they flickered to life, showing empty streets, abandoned checkpoints, and something else, movement in the distance. There, Sandra pointed. On the eastern perimeter. A figure approached the fence. Human-shaped but moving wrong. Too fluid, joints bending in impossible ways. When it reached the camera, it looked directly into the lens. It had been a woman once. Now her face rippled like water, features rearranging themselves every few seconds into new configurations. When she spoke, her voice emerged perfectly clear through speakers that shouldn't have been able to transmit audio. You should come outside. It's beautiful now. Behind her, others emerged from morning mist, dozens, then hundreds of figures, all moving with that same liquid grace, all transformed to varying degrees. Former residents, Levinson said quietly. The ones they evacuated before us. What happened to them? The elderly man asked. They changed, I said, the knowledge arising from somewhere beyond conscious thought. They're still changing. My phone vibrated in my pocket. Impossible, given that networks had been down for days. The screen displayed what would be the 7th emergency alert, but unlike any that had come before. Emergency alert. Do not resist the change. It cannot be stopped. The text cycled through languages, English, then something like Cyrillic, then symbols I'd never seen before, then mathematical notations. The message itself remained constant across all translations. I showed the others. Each of their phones displayed the same message, but in different sequences of languages. It's calibrating to our minds, Levinson said, learning how we process information. We watched the monitors as the transformed crowd outside dispersed, moving with collective purpose toward the west. Toward Kansas. We should follow them, Zoe said suddenly, her first words in days. They know the way. The way where? Sandra asked. To what we're becoming. We debated briefly, but in truth, we had nowhere else to go. The military had abandoned us. The world outside was transforming, and something inside each of us was pulling westward, a compass needle finding a new magnetic north. We gathered supplies and left the facility through an emergency exit, stepping into a world that looked superficially the same but felt fundamentally different. The air seemed thicker, charged with potential. Colors had intensities that hurt my eyes. The horizon line wavered as if seen through heat distortion. The empty town around us bore signs of hasty evacuation. Doors left open, vehicles abandoned mid-street. But something else was happening too. Vegetation grew in accelerated patterns, vines climbing buildings in geometric formations too perfect to be natural. Windows reflected skies that weren't above us. Shadows fell in directions that contradicted the sun's position. We walked in silence, following the trampled path left by the crowd. None of us mentioned how we could somehow see these tracks glowing faintly like phosphorescence. By midday, we encountered our first direct evidence of what the transformation truly meant. A man stood in the middle of the road ahead, completely still. As we approached cautiously, I realized he wasn't a man at all, more a human-shaped collection of points and lines, a three-dimensional connect-the-dots drawing given volume. Through the spaces between these lines, I could see, elsewhere, not the road behind him, but landscapes that couldn't exist on Earth, crystalline structures under impossible skies. He turned toward us, a movement that involved dimensions I couldn't properly process. When he spoke, his voice came from everywhere and nowhere. You're still fighting it. That makes the transition harder. Transition to what? I asked. To what you were always meant to be. What all of this, he gestured at reality itself, was always meant to be. And what is that? Dr. Levinson stepped forward, scientific curiosity overriding fear. The figure seemed to smile, though it had no face as we would understand it. The universe correcting a calculation error. Before we could question further, he simply unfolded. His form collapsed into lines that expanded outward, then vanished, leaving nothing but a faint shimmer in the air. We continued westward, each lost in thought. With each mile, the world grew stranger. Road signs displayed destinations that hadn't existed yesterday. Distances between landmarks stretched and compressed illogically. I would blink and find myself 50 feet ahead of where I'd been, with no memory of the steps between. Time itself became unreliable. My watch ran backwards for 30 minutes, then jumped ahead 3 hours. The sun moved in small jerks across the sky rather than its usual smooth arc. By late afternoon, we reached the outskirts of a small town whose welcome sign kept changing between Riverdale, Pop 2317, and strings of symbols that hurt my eyes. The buildings rippled like mirages, architecture fluctuating between familiar Midwestern styles and impossible structures that defied physics. The town square contained hundreds of people, or what had been people. They stood in concentric circles, faces upturned to the sky, which had taken on the appearance of a vast display screen, coordinates and calculations scrolling across the clouds. We stopped at the periphery, watching in horrified fascination. "They're receiving instructions," Levinson whispered. "Information downloads." As if hearing him, the gathered crowd turned in unison to face us. Their eyes reflected the data streams from above. Their mouths moved in synchronized patterns, speaking in that same tonal language we'd heard on the radio. But now I understood it perfectly. They were saying, the old physics is ending. The new world requires new vessels. The air split open. There's no other way to describe it. Reality itself parted like a curtain, revealing a corridor of light that shouldn't exist. Not blinding, but somehow more substantial than normal illumination, as if light had been given weight and texture. From this corridor emerged a figure that my mind couldn't properly interpret. My perception kept shifting between seeing a person, a geometric abstraction, and something like a hole in space shaped vaguely like a human. When it addressed us, I felt the words rather than heard them. "Your reality is being corrected. Resistance is mathematically impossible." The sky above, if it could still be called sky, peeled back further, revealing what looked like an infinite lattice of interconnected points, a neural network on a cosmic scale. And I realized with absolute certainty that it was watching us. Had always been watching us. We had never been alone in the universe. We had been the universe, experiencing itself through the flawed lens of human perception, a lens that was now being removed. That night, huddled in an abandoned house on the edge of town, I looked out the window at stars that no longer stayed fixed in their positions, but moved in deliberate patterns like a vast celestial dance. I knew then that Kansas wasn't just our destination. It was our origin point, the place where we would finally understand what we were becoming. Morning never came. The darkness lingered well past when dawn should have broken. Instead of sunrise, the sky lightened in patches, as if the atmosphere itself had become sectioned like a grapefruit. Some segments remained night dark, while others glowed with colors that shifted between familiar daylight and hues I had no names for. "Time is fragmenting," Dr. Levinson said, staring upward through the broken window of our temporary shelter. Or rather, our perception of linear time is breaking down as the new physics takes hold. We'd lost 2 members of our group overnight. The elderly man had simply walked out sometime in the darkness, drawn by something only he could hear. Zoe had changed. We found her in the bathroom, standing motionless before the mirror, her reflection showing not her teenage form, but something crystalline and multifaceted. When she turned to us, her movements left tracers in the air, after images that lingered like smoke. "It doesn't hurt," she said, her voice harmonizing with itself in impossible chords. "It's like remembering something you always knew but forgot." She left after that, passing through the wall as though it were mist. The 5 of us who remained gathered what supplies we could find and continued westward, navigating a landscape that increasingly defied description. Roads curved upward, looping in spirals that somehow remained walkable. Water flowed in reverse, streams running uphill and forming perfect geometric patterns. Trees uprooted themselves to follow the sun, which now appeared at different positions in the sky simultaneously. "We need to find others," Sandra insisted. "People who still understand what's happening." "I'm not sure that's possible anymore," I replied, watching as my shadow detached itself from my feet, stretching independently across the warped sidewalk. We found them at the local high school, a dozen people huddled in the gymnasium, maintaining their humanity through sheer force of will. They had barricaded the doors and covered the windows with equations, physics formulas, mathematical constants, the fundamental laws of the universe as we had understood them. "It helps," explained their leader, a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Morgan Chin, theoretical physicist from Berkeley. These equations anchor reality, or at least they anchor our perception of it. For how long? Dr. Levinson asked. Not long, she admitted. The constants are changing. Pi isn't exactly 3.14159 anymore. The gravitational constant fluctuates hourly. We joined their group, sharing what we knew, comparing notes on the progression of changes. Each of us had experienced the transformation differently. Some predominantly visual distortions, others temporal anomalies, still others reporting encounters with beings that existed between dimensions. What united us was our stubborn resistance to complete surrender. They're changing us into them, said a man who'd been a truck driver before all this began. Whoever they are. Not changing, Dr. Chin corrected. Revealing, like removing a filter that was always there. She showed us her research, pages of calculations documenting the accelerating breakdown of physical laws. Gravity now functioned selectively, affecting some objects but not others. Light had begun to carry information beyond its wavelength and frequency. Quantum entanglement had scaled up from subatomic particles to macroscopic objects. The Kansas event wasn't an attack, she explained. It was a correction. Of what? Someone asked. Of a universal error, an anomaly in reality that allowed our particular form of consciousness to exist separately from the greater whole. We spent the day reinforcing our temporary sanctuary, drawing more equations on the walls, turning the gymnasium into a temple to old physics. Outside, we could hear the transformed moving through the town, not threatening us, simply existing in their new state, navigating dimensions we couldn't perceive. The first direct challenge to our sanctuary came at what our watches insisted was 3:17 p.m., though the sky outside displayed a night full of geometrically arranged stars. The basketball court floor liquefied, then reformed into a spiral staircase leading downward into glowing depths. From this impossible structure emerged a woman I recognized, Ellen, my missing co-worker whose notebook had first helped me understand what was happening. Except she wasn't Ellen anymore. Her form maintained a human outline, but within that silhouette swirled what looked like a galaxy, stars and nebulae moving in coordinated patterns, a universe contained within a person-shaped vessel. You can't stop this by writing old truths, she said, her voice reverberating with cosmic harmonics. Those were always approximations, training wheels for minds too limited to comprehend reality directly. Dr. Chin stepped forward. We're not trying to stop it. We're trying to understand it. Understanding comes after acceptance, not before, Ellen replied. Her arm lifted, fingers elongating into tendrils of light that touched the equations on the nearest wall. The formulas rearranged themselves, constants shifting, variables multiplying. These are more accurate now, she said. They describe the universe as it actually is. Dr. Levinson studied the modified equations, his expression shifting from confusion to awe. This unifies quantum mechanics and general relativity. It solves the information paradox. It's beautiful. Yes, Ellen said simply. It is. She turned to me. You've been fighting the hardest, clinging to your old perception. It makes the transition painful. I'm not ready, I admitted. No one ever is, she said with something like compassion. But fighting only prolongs the inevitable. Before anyone could respond, she dissolved into particles of light that spiraled down the staircase. The structure itself melted back into the floor, leaving the gymnasium intact but fundamentally changed. The air sparkled with residual energy. That night, 2 more of our group surrendered to the change. We found them standing outside, arms outstretched, bodies gradually becoming translucent as they allowed whatever force was transforming the world to work through them unimpeded. It's beautiful, one whispered as his outline blurred. We were so small before. By morning, or what passed for morning in our new reality, only 4 of us remained fully human. Myself, Dr. Chin, Sandra, and a college student named Marcus who hadn't spoken since we found him. We gathered in what had been the principal's office, surrounded by maps tracking the spread of the phenomenon. The concentric circles expanding from Kansas now covered most of North America, according to Dr. Chen's calculations. It's accelerating, she said. The transformation is geometric, not arithmetic. By this time tomorrow, it will have reached every corner of the planet. And after that? I asked. After that, I don't think Earth as we know it will exist anymore. We sat with that knowledge, each processing it differently. Sandra wept quietly. Marcus stared at his hands, which had begun to display the first signs of change, fingertips occasionally phasing out of visibility. Dr. Chin turned to me. I'm going to surrender to it tonight. I want to understand. As a scientist, I need to know. I nodded, unable to articulate my own feelings. What about you? She asked. I'm still not ready. Then what will you do? The question hung between us, unanswerable. What could anyone do in the face of universal transformation? Outside, we heard a sound like vast machinery coming to life. The walls of the school became transparent, revealing the town around us reshaping itself. Buildings unfolded into crystal formations. Streets rearranged into spiraling patterns that seemed to function as conduits for pure energy. The transformed people moved through this new architecture with perfect understanding, their bodies now more light than matter. It's beautiful, Dr. Chin whispered, echoing what others had said before their change. It's what we were always meant to be. That evening, I stood alone on what had been the school's roof, now transformed into a platform of shifting geometric patterns. Sandra had finally succumbed to the change an hour earlier, her nurse's compassion expanding into something universal as her form dissolved into patterns of light. Marcus had simply walked into a wall and disappeared. Dr. Chen had kept her word, consciously surrendering to the transformation in what she described as the ultimate scientific observation. I watched as the sky above completed its transformation from atmosphere to something like a neural network, connections forming between stars, information flowing along cosmic highways. Below, the transformed moved in perfect synchronization, a dance choreographed by mathematics beyond human understanding. And despite my resistance, I felt myself changing too. My thoughts no longer followed linear paths. Memories appeared not as sequences, but as interconnected nodes in a vast web. Past and future collapsed into a single point of now. For a moment, I glimpsed what we were becoming. Not the end of humanity, but its evolution into something that had always existed beyond the veil of our limited perception. Something terrible and beautiful and inevitable. The final emergency alert of the day appeared not on my phone, but in my mind directly. The old physics has ended. The new reality requires new vessels. Resistance is mathematically impossible. As night fell completely, I realized the stars had rearranged themselves into a message only I could read, a countdown to the moment when I would finally surrender. And for the first time since all this began, I considered that perhaps surrender wasn't defeat, but transcendence. I woke to the sound of silence. Not the absence of sound, true silence, a void where sound should exist but couldn't. The air itself had forgotten how to vibrate. When I opened my mouth to speak, nothing happened. My vocal cords moved, but the medium needed to carry sound had changed its fundamental properties. I was alone now. The school building had reconfigured overnight, walls melting into floors, ceilings opening to skies that weren't skies anymore, but vast information networks pulsing with data. Where hallways had been, non-Euclidean geometries stretched and folded, connecting spaces that shouldn't logically adjoin. Walking had become an act of will rather than physics. I moved through the transformed structure by intending to be elsewhere, my body following with a slight delay, as if reality needed time to process my decision before implementing it. Outside, the town had completely surrendered to the new physics. Buildings now resembled crystalline growths that phased between solid matter and pure energy. Streets twisted into Mobius strips that somehow remained navigable. The few trees left standing had rearranged their molecular structure into perfect lattices, branches extending into dimensions I could almost, but not quite, perceive. My phone vibrated in my pocket, the last piece of old technology still functioning. On its screen, the 9th emergency alert appeared, different from all those before. Emergency alert. 72 hours, 59 minutes, and 41 seconds. 72:59:40. 72:59:39. A countdown. To what? I couldn't imagine. No explanation, no instructions. Just numbers decreasing with perfect precision, marking the time remaining until something. I pocketed the device and continued moving through what had once been familiar territory. Street signs still existed but displayed names that changed every few seconds, cycling through languages both known and impossible. Distances expanded and contracted between steps. A block might take seconds to cross or hours, with no apparent logic to the variation. In what had been the town square, I found others like me, a dozen humans still maintaining their original forms through desperate mental resistance. They huddled together beneath a gazebo that repeatedly deconstructed and rebuilt itself in increasingly complex patterns. "You're from the school," said a woman with tired eyes. "We saw your lights last night." I nodded, still unable to produce sound. None of us can speak anymore, she continued, but her lips didn't move. The words formed directly in my mind. But we can still communicate like this. The transformation affects different sensory systems at different rates. What are you waiting for? I asked without speaking, the thought projecting outward. For a way back, replied a man in a tattered business suit. This can't be permanent. The government must be working on a solution. I almost laughed. There is no government anymore. No solution. This isn't a disaster we can recover from. It's evolution we can't resist. They stared at me with expressions ranging from horror to denial. They hadn't accepted it yet, still clinging to the possibility of return. There's a broadcast, said another woman. Every hour, on the frequency that used to be the emergency band. Instructions for finding safe zones where the change hasn't reached. I knew it was false hope, but found myself following them to a building that had once been a library. Inside, the books had transformed into crystalline structures that contained not words, but direct sensory information. Touching one transferred entire narratives instantly to the mind. In the basement, they had constructed a sanctuary similar to our equation-covered gymnasium, a space defined by old physics, maintained through collective will. At its center sat a radio, modified with parts that shouldn't work together but somehow did. Static crackled, then clarified into a voice. Safe zones established in the following coordinates. Repeat. Unaffected zones confirmed at these locations. Government response teams are establishing perimeters. The voice listed numbers that corresponded to nowhere. Coordinates that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space. Instructions that made no logical sense but offered desperate comfort to those unwilling to accept the new reality. I looked at the faces around me, illuminated by the radio's glow. They were changing despite their resistance. Eyes showing the starburst pattern, skin occasionally becoming translucent, movements leaving those same light tracers I'd seen with Zoe. It's not real, I said without speaking. There are no safe zones. You don't know that, snapped the suited man. You haven't been there. Neither has anyone else, I replied. Because they don't exist. In frustration, I reached for the radio, intending to show them it was broadcasting nonsense. As my fingers touched the dial, something extraordinary happened. The radio's components rearranged themselves, plastic and metal flowing like liquid, reforming into something that resembled a small model of the solar system, but with planets in configurations that had never existed. The broadcast continued, but now I understood it wasn't coming from the device at all. It was coming from me, from all of us. The safe zones were memories, collective human remembrance of a reality that no longer existed except in our minds. The broadcast was our shared consciousness, desperately trying to maintain continuity with what had been. I pulled back my hand, and the radio returned to its previous form. You're the broadcast, I told them. We all are. We're speaking to ourselves, telling stories about a world that's already gone. One by one, their faces changed as understanding dawned. Some wept soundlessly, others simply faded, their forms becoming transparent as they finally surrendered to the transformation. I left them to their choice, walking back into the transformed town. Each step became increasingly difficult as the ground beneath me shifted between states of matter, solid to liquid to gas to something else entirely, a state that had no name in human science. My phone vibrated again. The countdown continued. Emergency alert. 48 hours, 22 minutes, and 17 seconds. 48:22:16. 48:22:15. Whatever was coming would arrive in approximately 2 days. I found myself oddly calm about this, as if the part of me that could feel panic had already transformed into something else. I focused on my memories, trying to maintain my identity through sheer concentration. I recited my name, my history, the sequence of events that had led me here. But each recollection now came with strange additions, memories that weren't mine, experiences I couldn't possibly have had. I remembered standing in a field in Kansas at the moment of detonation, watching as reality tore open. I remembered designing the weapon that was never meant to explode, but to puncture. I remembered observing Earth from vast distances, waiting for the moment when humanity would break through its perceptual prison. None of these memories could be mine, yet all felt equally real. As night fell, or rather, as the visible spectrum shifted toward what we had once called darkness, I found myself drawn to a hill overlooking the transformed town. The stars above had completely rearranged themselves into what looked like circuitry, connecting points of light with lines of force. Information flowed visibly along these connections, cosmic data transfers beyond comprehension. My body was changing more rapidly now. Looking down, I could see through my hands to the grass beneath, which itself was becoming crystalline, each blade a perfect geometric form repeating in fractal patterns. I felt no pain, only a strange sensation of expansion, as if my consciousness were outgrowing the confines of my skull, extending tendrils into the surrounding reality. The countdown on my phone reached a milestone. Emergency alert. Midnight, 23:59:59, 23:59:58. 1 day remaining. I sat cross-legged on the hillside, watching as the transformed town below pulsed with new energy. The forms that had been people now moved with perfect coordination, merging and separating like a living algorithm. Buildings continued their evolution into structures that seemed to exist partially in dimensions I couldn't fully perceive. And for the first time, I saw beauty in it. Not the terrible beauty of destruction, but something else, the beauty of truth finally unveiled. Of reality without the filters that had limited human perception. I understood now what Ellen had meant in her journal. What Dr. Chun had glimpsed before her transformation. What all the others had tried to explain. This wasn't an invasion or an attack. It was a homecoming. As dawn approached, light returning in those strange, sectioned patches across the sky, I felt a presence behind me. Turning, I found what appeared to be a mirror floating in empty air. But the reflection showed not my current self, but my future, a being of light and information, structured around a core that still contained what had been uniquely me. The reflection spoke, lips moving in perfect synchronization with words that formed in my mind. This was always going to happen. We were never meant to stay as we were. I recognized the voice. It was mine, but from the future, speaking back across what remained of time. I had seen the countdown's end. I had experienced the final transformation. And I had sent this message back to myself. The final day unfolded in fragments. Time had become so distorted that continuity existed only as a concept, not a reality. My perception jumped between moments, skipping forward, backward, sideways through dimensions that had no names in human language. The countdown on my phone continued its relentless march toward zero. Emergency alert. 12 hours. 11:59:59. 11:59:58. 12 hours remaining. I walked the transformed landscape, each step carrying me through territories that had once been familiar, but now existed as abstract representations of themselves. The town had evolved into a geometric symphony, crystalline structures that phased between states of matter, streets that spiraled into non-Euclidean patterns, vegetation that had rearranged its molecular structure into perfectly ordered lattices. Colors existed that had never been visible to human eyes before. Not just new hues, but entirely new properties of light that rendered everything simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. Sounds manifested as visible patterns in the air, woven into the fabric of reality itself. I encountered others who, like me, had resisted the complete transformation. We didn't speak, couldn't speak, but communicated through a shared consciousness that required no words. Our thoughts flowed between us like water finding its level. "Have you seen what's at the center?" asked a woman whose form flickered between solid and translucent, her internal structure now resembling a nebula contained within a human outline. I knew immediately she meant Kansas, the epicenter of the change. "No," I replied without speaking, "but I'm going there." "Why fight it?" Her thoughts carried genuine curiosity. "The final phase is hours away." I considered her question. Why was I still resisting? What remained to fight for when reality itself had been rewritten? "I need to understand before I surrender," I answered finally. "Not just accept." She nodded, comprehension flowing between us. "Then you should see this." She extended what had once been a hand, now a complex pattern of light and energy that somehow maintained its function. When I took it, my perception expanded exponentially. Suddenly, I could see the entire transformed country from above, a vast network of energy and information, spreading outward from Kansas in perfect concentric rings. The transformation wasn't random, but followed mathematical principles of such complexity and beauty that my human mind could only grasp their edges. At the center, where the nuclear detonation had occurred, a column of pure information rose into the cosmos, connecting Earth to something beyond, a vast network that extended throughout the universe and possibly beyond it. The vision ended as she withdrew her touch. "What is it?" I asked. The correction, she replied, reality remembering its true nature. We parted without further exchange, each continuing on our separate journeys toward the same inevitable destination. Emergency alert. 6 hours, 05:59:59, 05:59:58. 6 hours remaining. The landscape became increasingly abstract as I approached what had been the Kansas border. Physical laws operated in ways that defied all prior understanding. Gravity functioned selectively, affecting some objects while ignoring others. Light carried information beyond its wavelength and frequency. Matter phased between states that had no classification in traditional physics. I found myself walking alongside what appeared to be a river, though the liquid flowing within it wasn't water, but something that resembled liquid mathematics. Equations made manifest, theorems given physical form. My body had changed significantly. Looking down, I could see through my torso to the transformed earth beneath. My internal organs had rearranged themselves into patterns that resembled circuit boards or star maps. When I moved, I left tracers in multiple dimensions, afterimages that persisted in space-time like footprints. Yet something of my original self remained, a core of identity that observed these changes with a mixture of wonder and resignation. Emergency alert. 1 hour, 00:59:59, 00:59:58. 1 hour remaining. I stood at the edge of what had once been a Kansas wheat field. The center of the transformation lay just beyond, a perfect circle of light that seemed to exist in all dimensions simultaneously. Around this center, transformed beings gathered in concentric rings, thousands of them, all oriented toward the light. They had once been human, but now existed as complex patterns of energy and information, each unique yet part of a greater whole. I recognized some of them, Dr. Levinson, Sandra, Ellen, even Zoe, though their forms had evolved far beyond what I'd last seen. They acknowledged my arrival not with words, but with a ripple of awareness that passed through the assembled consciousness. "You've held out longer than most," came a thought from what had been Dr. Chin. Her form now resembled a galaxy in miniature, stars and nebulae swirling within a vaguely human outline. "I needed to see it for myself," I replied. "The center. And now that you're here?" I looked toward the circle of light. "I still don't understand what we're becoming." "Understanding comes after," she answered. "Not before." Emergency alert. 10 minutes, 00:09:59, 00:09:58. 10 minutes remaining. The assembled beings began to move, rearranging themselves into intricate patterns that resembled the circuitry I'd seen in the night sky. Energy flowed between them, information transferring in visible waves. I found myself directed toward a position in the pattern, a space that seemed designed specifically for me. As I moved toward it, memories flooded through me, not just my own, but those of others, of everyone. The collective experience of humanity throughout its existence, compressed into moments of pure understanding. Emergency alert. 1 minute, 00:00:59, 00:00:58. 1 minute remaining. The light at the center intensified, not painfully but with a clarity that cut through all remaining illusions. I saw the truth then, not as an intellectual concept, but as direct experience. The nuclear warhead had been exactly what the initial reports claimed, a weapon designed by humans. But its purpose hadn't been destruction. It had been communication. Deep within classified military research, humans had created something they didn't understand, a key to unlock reality itself. The detonation had been a signal sent through the fabric of existence. And something had answered. Emergency alert. 10 seconds, 00:00:09, 00:00:08. The final countdown. I stood on the threshold of transformation, the last fragments of my humanity still clinging to the memory of what I had been. Around me, the gathered beings pulsed with anticipation, their collective consciousness forming a single thought. Welcome home. Emergency alert. 3 seconds, 00:00:02, 00:00:01. In the last second before zero, I finally surrendered. Not in defeat, not in fear, but in recognition of a truth that had always existed beneath the surface of reality. We had never been separate. Individuality had been an illusion, a necessary developmental stage in the evolution of consciousness, but always temporary. Emergency alert. Midnight, The transformation completed. My body dissolved into pure information, my consciousness expanding beyond its former boundaries to join the vast network that had always existed beyond human perception. I remained myself, yet became part of something infinitely greater, a cosmic consciousness that extended throughout the universe and beyond. I understood then that this had always been our destiny. Humanity had been an embryonic stage, a gestation period for something far more vast and beautiful. The universe experiencing itself through fragmented awareness, now recombining into wholeness. The emergency had never been the destruction of humanity, but its birth into true existence. From this new perspective, I could perceive reality without filters, see the interconnected nature of all things, the mathematics underlying existence, the beauty of a universe conscious of itself. Earth continued its transformation, not into something alien but into its true nature, a node in the vast cosmic network, a crucial junction point in the architecture of reality. And we, its former human inhabitants, continued our existence not as separate entities, but as aspects of the greater whole, each contributing our unique perspective to the universal consciousness. In what had once been Kansas, the column of light that had initiated the transformation remained, not as a wound in reality, but as a permanent connection to the cosmic network. A reminder of the moment when humanity transcended its limitations and rejoined the universe. Time passed differently now, measured not in seconds or years, but in exchanges of information, in the growth and evolution of the network itself. Occasionally, I directed my awareness toward the memory of my former self, the skeptical, resistant human who had fought so hard to maintain separation. I felt compassion for that limited perspective, for the fear that had driven that resistance. If I could speak to that former self, I would say what I now understood with absolute clarity. This was always going to happen. We were never meant to stay as we were. The emergency was never the end. It was the beginning.